Good afternoon. My name's David Rockland. I'm with Ketchum. I'm also the chairman. Let's see if I can make this work. Nope. There we go. I'm the chairman of the North American chapter of AMEC, and it's my pleasure to run this afternoon's session. To do so, I want to ask Andre. Andre, there's a song. It starts, I want to tell you a story. What's the next line? About a woman I know. Okay, this is actually a story about a conference we all know, and I figured since we were in a guitar-based hotel, little AC/DC lines wouldn't hurt just to get us thinking this way. So the story about the little conference begins in Berlin in 2009, where there was a paper which I gave, and several others gave papers along the same lines, that talked about AVEs and their relevance or lack thereof. And it sort of erupted into a whole lot of Twitter conversation and email conversation, and basically a whole lot of, you could either call it chaos, you could call it dialogue, you could call it interest, you could call it what became a great idea in Barry Leggiter's mind, which was that a year later, when we would get together in Barcelona to, in fact, for the first time as an industry, come up with 7 principles, one of which is basically AVEs are wrong. That basically define the, let's call it the foundation of what is communications measurement. And so that's what we did in Barcelona, and I'm sure many of you, I hope all of you have heard of the Barcelona principles. But really that sort of set a floor. And a year later, a year ago now, we met again in Lisbon and defined almost, let's call it a ceiling or a future that basically outlined the most important things that we as an industry should be focused on. And they really fell into 3 buckets. One bucket was around ROI and analytics, and you saw that materialize, for example, in David Kellis's presentation from Clorox yesterday in Workshop D about how do you measure the ROI of social media. You heard it from Andre Manning this morning when he talked about ROI and analytics and that the puzzle is still not solved, but it's a workable puzzle. For example, at Philips. We also talked about social media in Lisbon last year and the importance of establishing standards or protocols or approaches. And so you'll see a lot of tomorrow that Tim Markline and Richard Bagnall, Katie Payne, Mike Daniels, Don Bartholomew will really help to address and focus on that subject tomorrow. But there were 2 other priorities last year in Lisbon that were right at the top, in the top 4, and they had to do it with education. And how do we create, and I'm going to borrow words from my friend Casey Brown, who was our gracious host last night, around basically what are we all about? Probably a fundamental tenet is that we're all about creating an educated client, a client who's educated around how do you do PR measurement or communications measurement well, and basically with an educated client, since AMEC is a trade association, it really is about advancing the trade, if you will, or the business. And an educated client is sort of critical to that. So this afternoon session is really all around what does client or PR practitioner education look like. And so I want to lay out sort of what we're going to do here. You'll notice that hopefully when you sat down on something. You should have a little voting gizmo. For those of you who haven't had this experience before of voting, this is one of Barry's favorite things that we do. We hopefully have it right. I think we're good at this year on it. We got some. We're going to have a lot of votes, and then they'll start in just a moment because we're going to have a practice vote, which you'll see here in just a second. Because when we get to the serious part, you're really going to want to know how to do this stuff. But basically, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Chris and Grant about some new research that really lays out priorities for the key skills and abilities and knowledge levels that one would hope to see from a PR practitioner. If you imagine being in your research course in your undergraduate studies at a college or university, what would that course be focused around? That's really what they're going to address, and they're going to address it both from a sort of a PR practitioner basis, but also from a C-suite level, since their company works very closely with the C-suite of many companies around the world. After that, they're going to lay out, I believe it's 9 specific items, and then we're going to vote on those 9. And really, they're all important, but the question is, which are more important? You can't boil the ocean, right? So you got to choose some more important than others. and that'll be the first real round of voting. We'll take a little bit of a break. Then we're going to bring up a panel of experts who, now that in the first part we've sort of said, okay, what should an education program be about? We're going to have a panel of experts come up and talk with us about how do you do it. And in fact, they're so expert that we had to also have 3 professional commentators who will add to their expertise to really bring this idea together. And while that's taking place, we're actually going to be writing, if you will, a series of steps of how do you roll out a global education campaign or program for public relations measurement. And at the very end of our session today, around 5:20 or so, I think if we stay right on time, we'll vote again on a set of priorities there. And so our outcomes here today will really be in and around, okay, what do we think are most important to educate clients or practitioners around? And then, frankly, how do you do it? And what should be the first steps, and the second steps, and the third steps in such an education campaign? However, as you've noticed, we've called these things something, right? So there was the Barcelona Principles. Then it was the the Lisbon, I called it Legacy, Barry called it Accord. We didn't quite, I think we settled on Accord. But we need to call the Dublin, what we're going to come out here today with something, right? Dublin something or other. So I believe we're going to vote now. And I'm going to show you different ideas about what we might call the outcome of today. And let me explain voting, how this works, okay? Don't do anything yet, okay? Let's start with that idea. Do something when a little clock starts ticking in the bottom right corner of this screen, which Bernard, I believe, and I were going to make eye contact, and that'll happen. So once, all you're going to do is you're going to decide which of these 6 you would like to, or which of these 5, you would like to call the outcome of today. And if you don't like any of them and want to send the people who came up with this, which was me this morning at breakfast, jotting things down, back to the drawing board, we can go with the last one. So when it's time to vote, you push the right number on your gizmo. We're going to have 10 seconds for every vote. So everything we do today is in Barry time, as in it's fast. We're just moving this thing along all the time. Does that work? Does everybody understand? Does everybody have a gizmo? Oh, yeah? Eve, you good? Good. All right. Let's go. Bernard, you ready? All right, let's try it the first time. All right, turns out not to be actually mission impossible. And we have a clear winner. Yeah, a very clear winner. Total winner. I do want to talk to whoever voted for number 6. Bernard, we know who those people are, right? Great. We will want to talk with them. But given that they're 4 times less than number 2, I guess the outcome of today will be called the Dublin Declaration. Is that fair? You guys good for that? I like it. All right. Great. Thank you very much. By the way, when you do vote, you're only allowed usually to vote once, and we'll explain the once or the twice in a couple of more of our votes. If you violate voting rules, Bernard knows who you are, okay? And your little gizmo will emit an electric shock that will hurt a real lot. So if the person next to you suddenly goes leaping up in the air, you know that they are not playing by the rules of voting that we're going to go forward with. So I want to introduce to you our 2 speakers from Booz Allen Hamilton. And what's great about their company is, as I mentioned, they really work a tremendous amount with the C-suite. The people that we often deal with are usually not in the C-suite. They're the vice president of something or the director of public relations, but they're not sitting there with a CEO or COO, CMO kind of title. And so they really bring to us, and frankly, having joined us, I think have brought to AMEC a much broader perspective on really the industry as well as how we as an organization might think of ourselves and function moving forward. So they've been so gracious to do research really first in Hong Kong and now here in terms of what is important in terms of a global education program. I want to introduce to you Chris Foster on my far left. He's a principal. He's a principal at Booz Allen Hamilton. He's responsible for strategic communications, particularly in the area of healthcare. He's joined by Grant McLaughlin, who is a vice president with the company, and really, as I understand, you really run the whole communications area within Booz Allen Hamilton. And we're delighted to have you both here, and it's your show.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks so much. So, as I'm going to advance the slides here. I think David's done a good job of talking about who we are as Booz Allen. So I'm going to sort of spare you of that. But we want to talk about the measurement debate. And what we've been thinking about is sort of this need for change. And I think what we've heard a lot about over the last few days and seen is that there's some trends that are emerging, and it's sort of forcing us to think a little bit differently about how we do our jobs, think a little bit different about how we interact and talk about measurement and communication. So what we did as Booz Allen is tried to look a little deeper. We believe in a very evidence-based approach to how we perform and do strategic consulting and strategic communication. So we have sort of been spending the last few months in collaboration with AMIC going on what we're calling this sort of global communications tour, and taking, as David mentioned, all the activity, energy, and insights from Lisbon to Barcelona to Asia Pac and now to Dublin. And really what we've been looking at is, where are there trends? Where are we able to spot trends that are unique? Are there differences across geographies? We've also looked at trying to answer questions, gosh, is there enough information that we have about the current state today to be able to allow us to predict where we may be as an industry or a profession tomorrow? Because a lot of what we try to do is anticipate, sort of prepare for where we may be tomorrow, but anticipate some of those challenges. So we look at that as well. We talked about the Lisbon list. I'm not going to go over this, but this sort of gave us some guidance into sort of 4 core areas that I think the organization's been looking at over the past few years. Coupled with Hong Kong, which was Booz Allen's first foray into global trend spotting, there were a couple of things that were interesting from that perspective. One is it became very clear in looking at feedback from Asia Pac that there's a real thirst and a real need for metrics to support business decisions. The other piece, the other 2 issues that are interesting, I think we've talked a little bit about that over the past day and a half, have been the great need for a common vernacular around ROI. ROI continues to be a problem. It was a problem 2 years ago in Barcelona. It was a problem in Asia Pac, and it is absolutely a problem that we're sort of talking about today, and we need to sort of reconcile to some extent. There's an interest in some standardized set of metrics. We talk a lot about metrics, but from PR professional standpoint and from the delegates in the room, what we've gotten is they'd love some guidance on what metrics should look like. How should we embrace metrics? How should we handle metrics? So we then have spent the past few weeks querying the Dublin delegates to try to get a sense of where this group was on some of the questions and some of the trends. So we asked the big question, what are the biggest challenges to measuring the value of public relations? The big 3 that came out were budget constraints, time restrictions, and establishing cause and effect. This is the size, the word cloud's the size of the words are what's important. 2 things here that for me, as a consultant, sort of stand out. One is this budget constraint issue. This seems to come up quite often, and it always presents itself in a different way. Sometimes it presents itself as we don't have enough money to do measurement, or it's not a part of our campaign, or we can only do half of it, or we don't have, so there's always a question around budget, which always is a little frustrating to me, because I believe, and it's been my experience, that if there's money, if there's budget to launch a campaign, then there's budget to measure it. I don't believe that there are I believe that all communications involves measurement and evaluation. I think it must. I believe sort of measurement is sort of what gets us beginning. It's in the middle and it's the end. It's throughout, because I think all good plans are built to flex, and we need data and insights to flex. The other part of this that's interesting to me is this whole notion of cause and effect and what we can own. I guess what can we claim as PR professionals that what we've impacted. And I think that I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide, because this seems to continue to come up around, well, can we take credit for driving market share as PR? Can we take credit for sales? And I believe, in a lot of respects, we can. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. The other question we asked and got some insights on were, what do we believe the greatest barriers are to the adoption of standard research techniques for measurement evaluation? And this is interesting as well. Globalization, which I think is an important one. We need to be very sensitive to what may work in one region, may not work in another. So we need to be sensitive to regional differences, and I think that's important. Limited resources, I think, when you think about the world and globally, are also important to continue to come up. But the value definition variance is one that I've sort of spent some time thinking about over the past few weeks. There seems to be a debate that's brewing that we've seen consistently around the value of communication. What is the value of the work that we do as communication professionals? And I struggle with this a little bit, and here's why. I believe in the power of communication to solve some of the toughest business problems that we have. And if you listen to some of the folks on client side talk earlier today, a lot of what I felt like I heard is that they have real problems that they're trying to solve. And if we believe as practitioners that communication can solve these problems, then there's no question around the value of communication, because we're actually in the problem-solving business, and we're using a suite of communication tools to do that. So I challenge us to think about the value of what we do as PR communications very differently than I think we have in the past. Like I said, I believe that it is an incredibly strategic, incredibly powerful business tool. And if you solve a problem for a client, then budget doesn't become an issue, to my way of thinking, and that's what we've seen. So these are this is just a perspective that we have based on sort of this listening tour that we've been engaged in the past several months. Another interesting point to share is we posed the question around how important is it that the following are understood by public relations professionals over the next 5 years. And this is interesting because what this does in our mind, if you look at the top three, the focus on measurement goals and objectives, the focus on measurable objectives, and measuring campaigns, this, to my way of thinking, it continues to validate the relevance and importance of the Barcelona principles. Because if you think about the top few principles, that's what this organization set out to standardize years ago. And it's even as important, if not in some cases, we've heard, even more important today. There's almost more of a sense of urgency today than there was back then. And I think so that to us is reassuring, because I think we're headed in the right direction. The other issue here, which is something that Grad's going to talk about a little bit, and David mentioned, is our focus really working with the C-suite. We started seeing a trend emerge in our data that was really around barriers to access to, barriers to adoption around measurement and evaluation. And the focus seemed to be on, there may not be as much appreciation of what we do in the C-suite. And that just, to me, it seemed somewhat counterintuitive. So we wanted to figure out what the problem was. What was the C-suite expecting to hear that they may not be hearing? So we went and asked a question, among our peer professionals. And what we found out is, I think we have a good old-fashioned communication dilemma. The way we're actually talking about what PR and communications can do for companies may not be translating to what the C-suite wants to hear. So I think if we start to reframe how we talk about measurement, evaluation, and communications, the power of communications in PR, I think we're going to get a very different reaction, because what the data showed us is that there is tremendous value among the C-suite for communications, and even more value for measuring the impact of communications campaigns. Tremendous value there, which was I said, a little contrary to what we'd actually heard and seen in some of the surveys, which is why we dug deeper in that. So we'll share some other CEO data that I think you may find interesting and informative as you move forward. We looked a little bit around challenges, around barriers to measurement, and I'm going to sort of go through these a little quickly, because we talked about these a lot over the last 2 days. But it's probably no surprise to see some of the results here on the slide. The one that seems to continue to rise to the top is the resources from the standpoint of staffing. And I think there's a perception that to do measurement effectively, it requires a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of people. And I think that in some cases that may be the case, but I think in other cases, I think there are some solutions that I've seen and been hearing about that may actually allow you to do a lot more with less when you lean on technology. And I see one of the things we saw in Hong Kong was how to leverage and lean on technology a lot harder, again, to deliver real impactful and high quality measurement evaluation. I think that's one of the good things that has emerged from social media recently. We looked at digital media. We've talked a lot about social media and digital media relative to metrics, and I think it's probably not a surprise. Actually, it may be a little bit. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. What is exciting about digital media that we saw in Hong Kong, we didn't see as much. I think it's just the maturity of the market. We didn't see it as much in Barcelona. We saw it in Hong Kong. We absolutely saw it from this group, is the benefit and the impact of social media on our ability to manage things, to measure things like sentiment. And what has that done for me? And what do I actually do with the data? How can I use the data differently as far as moving towards outcomes? So I think that I think speaks to a level of maturity relative to social media and its proliferation and communications. We then asked the question, or we tried to look at this whole notion of competencies. And I think we're going to spend the afternoon talking about competencies. And David set that up very well, saying, what are the core set of competencies that we want to make sure that all communications and/or PR professionals need to have and want to have? And what's good, and this has been very consistent globally over the past 3 years, is that an understanding of how to write goals and set goals and objectives was key. A recognition around optimal measurement evaluation techniques is important. And then to understand the balance and the importance of both traditional and social media. So social media didn't necessarily replace traditional media. And so it really is a mix of such. And I think to be able to understand and appreciate how to leverage both of those has been insightful and important as well. So the last set of data that we looked at, it's no surprise to anyone that we are sort of in an odd place relative to the global economy. So I was really interested in trying to understand what impact the global economic situation has had on communication budgets. And it's probably no surprise that about 71% of the delegates said there has been an impact and it's been fairly negative. What's interesting to me about the economic questions, I asked the same question around measurement. What impact has the global economic situation had on measurement budgets? And there was only 54% of delegates thought it had an impact, which to me, it goes back to my earlier slide. I think it's really, I would imagine that those would be equal, because I don't believe that you should have communication over here on an island and measurement over here on an island, so they'd be so separate. I really do think they need to be together. We need to merge, we need to blend these together. So that says to me we may have to, I would challenge us to almost reorient our thinking a little bit and even challenge some of the PR professionals in the room and our colleagues to think a little bit differently about the close relationship between measurement, evaluation, and communication. So there are a couple top-level summaries, highlights that I want to share with you, and then I'll ask Grant to share some other data. The first part of that is, and I'm sure it's no secret, that the practitioners need metrics to support business decisions that will allow us to be much more impactful and persuasive in the C-suite and engage with boards of directors. And we know that there's an interest and there is a value for what we do. I'd say the second piece is that we need to look a little bit deeper, and I think we've sort of been talking a little about that, from outputs to outcomes, and diving much deeper into things like sentiment and awareness, what awareness does to me, and sentiment. And then I thought we heard from Andre about some really impactful tools that they're using at Philips. I think it's important. I'd say the economy has definitely had a negative impact to some extent, but I think what it's done is it's forced the industry and it's forced practitioners to be a lot more creative, a lot more resourceful, and in making the case for communications and for measurement communication, because you're going to need to make every dollar stretch, every dollar count, which I think has been important. And the last three are, there's absolutely an expectation and a need and a desire for communications, measurements, standards, and practice among the profession. There's a real desire for that. And I think this organization is primed to lead in that effort, and probably one of the more credible institutions that can actually sort of drive a global dialogue around standards and metrics as well. And I'd say the profession's greatest need is for the development of measures around multiple PR activities, and then finally, a standardization around metrics and ROI around communication effectiveness also seems to continue to emerge as a need and a concern, and that's been very consistent. So I'm going to let my colleague Grant McLaughlin, talk a little bit about some of our our environmental scan and some of our CEO data, and then I'll sort of come back and then share some other thoughts with you. So thanks.
So I would foot stomp on what Chris said in terms of bringing communications with measurement together. I would foot stomp and add to make sure that research is coupled right there as well, right? So all three things need to be blended simultaneously, because as we're going through the environmental scan, not only the research that we did, but also some ancillary products that we took a look at and combined in together, and that only accentuated what we had done, indicate that there is, as Chris mentioned, there's a great desire to have this data in the C-suite. Not necessarily just for the CEO, but for every other member, right? So if you're looking at social media, I heard multiple things today about social media in the conversation. I guarantee you that the chief technology officer, the CIO, the CISO, the chief marketing officer, everybody cares about that activity. How do you engage in that activity? I would also say that the other challenge that we talked about from a financial perspective in the use of technology, there is a desire and an expectation that technology is going to prove more efficiencies in the cost of running the business. So all of those people are looking at technology to enable all these different elements, right? So how do we actually do that? Part of the data also comes up that says that the affordability, or I can't spend the time, I don't have the resources, I don't have the money to measure, is not acceptable, right? In the C-suite, it's not acceptable. The answer that they're having is what gets measured is what gets done, right? And so to not have measures that get to a point where you can actually drive the change that they want to see is not going to be acceptable in that level. So to Chris's point about outputs versus outcomes, really driving either, and it may not necessarily be for the long haul, you probably have to do both the output and the outcome measure, but you've got to lead with the outcome that you have intended, right? So what is that behavior change you're trying to drive, and then back into it. One of the stories that Chris was talking about this, and David when he was introducing us. So why is Booz Allen a management consultancy here today? Right, there's a nice blend. Is that we run a practice within the consultancy of about 600 communications professionals. We're brought in often by the C-suite to actually engage in that conversation. We do public sector, private sector, and not-for-profits. And one of the stories I could tell you from a public sector is working with some public affairs people in the US Army. We're having a very big, exciting moment because they had reached a major milestone with Pinterest. Okay? Anybody in here in the US Army? Anybody married to an Army? Anybody affiliated with the Army? Any Army families? Okay. So Pinterest is a big deal to the US Army. Does anybody know why?
The wives and the family.
Exactly, the wives and family members. It is a big deal. And that it is not only the soldier, but it is everybody else that's affiliated with them. And it drives a lot of behavior because a lot of the decisions are being made by that wife. So the US Army pays a lot of attention to spouses and families. It was a great big deal. They led with this milestone. And they get, they're in the Office of Chief Public Affairs and they're getting up there and it's going up to the Secretary of the Army and Secretary McHugh is like, what's Pinterest? Why do I care about this? But they didn't lead with his priorities, which are reducing suicide, driving cost efficiencies, making sure that the soldier is taken care of, or soldier is taken care of. If they had led with those activities on an outcome basis of what he is trying to drive at that C-suite level, the whole conversation would have been different. Instead, we got lots of questions, and what the hell are you spending your money on? And but it would have been a very different activity if they had come at it from the way he was thinking, right? And so that's kind of the, if you're looking at this from the environmental scan, there's a disconnect in the way that PR practitioners look at things versus the C-suite. And that ideal state, using the research-driven data to demonstrate the values that strategic communications delivers, right? That's a lot of things that Chris was mentioning earlier. Okay, so how do we get there, right? So this demand for a data-driven campaign, how do we create those not only measures, but how those measures are then deployed? I heard a little bit today, somebody was talking about the fact that, I think it was the conversation around Microsoft and how people were looking at the prime score and how do we change the prime at different points. And I would argue that we probably need, I don't know how fast they were moving, but the measures need to be set, they need to be tested, they need to be exercised, and they need to be changed on a pretty regular basis, but it's got to be some continuum of time, not intervals, right? I don't like my score, therefore I'm changing the measure. That behavior, which I see a lot, to try and make the profession look better, can't go on, right? That is something that you take a hypothesis approach. These are the things I want to do, and I'm going to set it out for some period of time and then move through. So that data-driven campaign with a set of measures is absolutely key. Okay, so some of the things that we found, that outcome-oriented approach, the metrics, those are preferred based on what they're looking for as a collective group. That reputation management is reflected in goodwill on the bottom line. So not only looking at the costs that you're driving, but how you're actually bringing down the bottom line of the entire organization. Okay, what they're looking for is real value, not the perceived value. And I see this a lot in the conversations around social media especially. It's almost viewed as a toy, and there is real opportunities to make it a tool. And how do you have that conversation to be able to drive that through is getting into this, what is the actual value of this? So that set of measures is absolutely key. Okay. All right, so these are a couple of the other things that we looked at, and we can make these available to you as well. A couple of different studies, one from Thomson Reuters, and then one from another PR communications activity. It basically corroborate exactly what we're saying. Setting those objectives up front, absolutely key based on the priorities for the year. Measures to the outcomes, not the outputs, as we've mentioned. Okay, social media. One of the things here, just another story that I would tell is the power of social media on your organization doesn't necessarily have to be for PR purposes, right? If you take that active listening role for your organization, lots of people are going to gain from it. Another U.S. public sector organization that I can talk about is TRICARE. TRICARE is the insurance agency for the U.S. military that basically pays for all 9.6 million beneficiaries, essentially, coverage for their insurance. They have a lot of antiquated rules in their policies. The conversation is already going on somewhere. It's just, is the TRICARE organization, is the US military listening to the conversation? And what we were finding through a lot of different social media activities is that they weren't listening. They weren't listening to those 9.6 million beneficiaries that they thump their chest every day to say, you know, we take care of you, you do your job, we'll take care of you, don't worry about it. And a painful topic was the subject of rape, is that in the policies, the cost of a rape kit changed based on where the rape occurred. Very painful conversation going on for a very small part of that 9.6 million beneficiaries. But an important part based on the PR of the US military, right? How they actually, real or perceived, take care of their beneficiaries. If the rape occurred on-site of military facility, military base, military property, it was covered. If it was off on the military personnel, it was not. Simple, right? By a policy standpoint, that probably makes sense. But it was a very painful conversation for a very small populace who found each other and were talking about it. Based on our use of social media through not a PR group, but for a different group, we're able to gather that data, be able to walk into the admiral and say, you got a problem, right? Instantaneously, policy has changed. It's a very, very small group of population, didn't cost anything, perception goes up dramatically. So great opportunity to use social media for the C-suite's needs, goals, desires, et cetera. Okay, so best practices. So one of the things that I would hope that this group would pick up and kind of run with is what I've been noodling in my head. It's called a mega community. And one of the things that we've put out in a couple of different venues is the world's toughest problems can't be solved by any one single entity. So all of you come from different places. All of you have a very similar struggle. How do we get to a common set of language? How do we get to a common set of measures that can then go back and help the industry as a whole, help educate not only future PR people, but also the C-suite about the value of PR. So that mega community has multiple different roles. You've got a convener, you've got a funder, you've got thought folks, people who are going to do intellectual capital. How do you bring them all together to create that and then execute on that, right? So there's multiple different roles by multiple different organizations that have a common overlapping vital interest, right? And so this organization has that opportunity to create that ideal situation around measures, right? So looking at this, a couple of things to think through on this best practices of what that mega community around measures would be is who owns the campaign and why, right? You can't necessarily pick up a metrics organization to be the front group, somebody who's as a vendor selling measurement, right? But they have a vital role in the organization. Determine who owns that campaign and why. And then focus on the behaviors you want to see. What are those behavior changes you need in the industry? What are those behavior changes you need in the C-suite? And articulate them and get them on paper. Really focus in on that set of terminology, that common interest. And then looking at the messages you want to deliver and then who needs to deliver them specifically to help shape the industry. So are there any educators in the room? Anybody working with academic institutions? Right, so, okay, so one. My guess is there's a lot of the converted in the room. There's a lot of other people who need to be in part of that dialogue, right? And I would say educators is probably key to shaping the industry for the future, right? You have the opportunity to do that here. How do you engage them in the dialogue? Okay. Okay. Okay, so where do we go from here? This is the set. Actually, I'm going to turn this back to you now that you're out.
All right. Thanks. So thanks, Grant, for that. So one of the things we wanted to then share with you, just in keeping on with the program, is looking at the competencies that came out of Hong Kong. And these are the 12. We had a very similar session, similar discussion. And it became, these 12 competencies were voted upon, and the delegates in Hong Kong said these are the 12 competencies that if our communication PR professionals were proficient in, that would help us. We then looked at the data we just presented, sort of cross-referenced it and said, well, gosh, if we think about the feedback we've gotten from the team, the delegates in Dublin, this list of 12 is really a list of 9. There's some overlap, there's some economies of scale, there's some efficiency. So what we'd love to do is have you all look at this list of 9 and answer the question, and I'm going to turn this over to Dave in a second, answer the question the question will be, what 6 competencies of the 9 do you believe PR and communication professionals need to be proficient in order to do and execute the types of things we're talking about today relative to supporting the industry? And we're going to turn this over, do you need this?
Nope, I think we're
to
good.
David, and we're going to vote, I think.
Yeah, actually, I don't want to deprive folks here of any questions they might have for you. And we're doing fine on time, I believe. We're at 45 minutes, and the session's going to run an hour.
Perfect.
So just, why don't we take just a couple minutes if there are questions for you, and then we're going to tell you about how to vote on the 9. So it isn't really to vote out anything as much as to prioritize this list, since, again, you really can't boil the ocean. But before we do that, questions for Chris or for Grant? Eve?
Yeah. Can you clarify on...
I can do that.
It sounds like it.
Can you clarify the survey went to delegates as well as clients? Was that?
So there were sort of 2 surveys. There's a sort of CEO data that was more of an environmental scan, and we did talk to our clients for that. Then there was a delegate survey that went to the Dublin delegates and also members of AMIC.
Okay, that's what I would want to know.
Other questions? Sir.
Just Paul Farrell, moreover, I was just curious, gentlemen, how you handled, once the Admiral made the decision, did you communicate back through social media, or did they get a letter from the insurer? How did you handle the communication of the decision?
Very privately. Very privately. Very small group of people, very painful topic, and it was a very private discussion.
Last question.
Hi there, Emma Gorman from Tourism Ireland again. I'm practitioner. I'm one of the people you want to educate. So tell me, how do I recognize how to measure traditional and social media consistently?
How do you
I think that's one of the points that came out this morning, that there basically is no consistent measurement of social media.
Yeah, I guess what I'd say is I'd start at 2 steps in my mind before that. I'd start at, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Right? And if I can figure out what the problem I'm trying to solve is, whether, and I believe very, very, very firmly that the problem is a market growth issue, if the problem is a sales issue, if the problem is a reputation issue, if I can diagnose a problem for a client, I can solve it. I think communications can solve it. So rather than try to back end and re-engineer, how do I do it? I would say, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Let's put communications program against that. I'm either going to solve the problem or not. I'm believing you're going to solve it, and then you don't have to worry about social versus traditional media. Takes it out of play. It also elevates, to my way of thinking, it elevates the role of the practitioner and the tools that the measurement companies are actually able to provide, which is what we want.
And I think some of that idea around consistency between the, let's call them different channels, has to do with really recognizing what's fundamental within the Barcelona ideas, which is it's about quantity and quality as well. Too often what we find ourselves doing, for example, in traditional media, you count clips and impressions. In social media, you'll count Twitter activity and Facebook likes. Nothing about whether there's any quality, if it's good or bad or indifferent or whatever. And that's what that idea, I think, is intended to connote, at least on this chart here.
And I agree, Dave, so thank you for clarifying and helping with the answer. But the only thing I'd say is there are, as Grant mentioned, we have 600 or so communication professionals, and we do lots of communications campaigns, we do stakeholder engagement for our clients, and rarely is media a metric of success. Very rarely. I'd say in less than 10% of the engagements we have is media clips or media activity a metric of success. Because I can't always control it either, so I'm happy that that's not the case. But I'd say I would just ask us to think about that. And the reason that is in fact the case is because I'm not leading with media as a solution.
I think going back, somebody raised it earlier today in one of the conversations, about 90% of the conversation happens off social media. It is all about the dialogue. Figuring out where that community exists, whether it's online, offline, in local communities, and driving it to that local conversation, and whether that's a not-for-profit, or a public sector organization or a private sector organization. They are concerned about where that community exists and how do I get into the conversation.
And the only last point I'd say, Dave, I'm trying to wrap up, but I just think it'd be helpful because I want to make sure that you all don't think that I'm just sort of coming at this from the perspective of management consultant. So prior to Booz Allen, I'd spent I'd spent 12 years prior to this in large global PR firms. I ran Burson Marstello's global healthcare practice in North America. I was at Fleischman Hillard. I ran a small agency. So I was trying to do the stuff we're talking about while I was on the agency side, working with Cision and working with Vocus and others. And it was only that the consulting firm allowed us different voice to get a little more mind share. So so I do understand the challenge that we have when we're sort of put into a media mindset from that standpoint.